So, good afternoon, everyone. I will be reporting all about the uses of ICT policies in the teaching and learning environment. Now, policymakers and researchers globally acknowledge the importance of developing a school based ICT policy plan to facilitate the integration of information and communication technology and education. This is because teachers are more convinced that the educational achievement of pupils are anticipated to good ICT use. Also, in some many countries, the use of ICT in education and training has become a priority during the last decade. However, very few have achieved this progress, since indeed a small percentage of schools in some countries have reached the high levels of effective use of ICT to support and change the teaching and learning process in many subject areas. Others are still in the early phase of information and communication technology adoption. That is why, despite the interest of implementing ICT policy in education, there is this little known about how schools can improve their local ICT policy capacity and how to launch an effective ICT policy plan. Now, a lot of resources have been invested by many governments across the world to ICT development to improve teaching and learning using technology in schools. New educational ICT policy issues emerge, and new patterns of ICT related practices are evident in education. Since the implementation of ICT policy, it has been an effective way to support traditional learning methods, since many teachers uses ICT to know how ICT can promote teaching and learning, as it has been proven that students have lots of benefits of new technologies. Also, literature shows that ICT has a potential to enhance the teaching and learning process in many ways if it is well utilized in learner-centered schools. According to research conducted by C.Domopoy of 2010, it shows that learning activities that are challenging, authentic, multisensorial, and multidisciplinary students are motivated with higher attendance report, motivation, and academic accomplishment as a result of an effective ICT programs. That is why it is important to have or to implement an ICT plan that is well made and well planned before implementing such policy. Now, when there are potential and promise of ICT use in education, there are also perils related to the destruction of existing traditional teaching and learning practices, such as the high cost, increased responsibilities on teachers, equity and issues around data privacy and security. This is because when implementing ICT policy in education, these mentioned high cost, increased responsibilities in teacher, equity, and issues around data privacy and security can be the consequences or can be the result of implementing ICT policy. That is why four broad tangled issues must be addressed when considering the overall impact of the use of ICTs in education, the effectiveness, cost equity, and sustainability. That is why it is very important to implement an ICT plan that are formulated well and is studied and proposed well, so that there may be relevant evidences as to not have a negative impact in implementing ICT policy, since the educational effectiveness of ICTs depends on how they are used and for what purpose. This is because ICTs do not work in other educational tools or educational delivery for everyone or everywhere in the same way. That is why it is important to have an effective strategic plan before implementing an ICT policy. In developing countries, education takes place under situations that are substantially different from those in developed countries. The poorest countries spend the least proportionately on non salary related educational expenditures, such as the Philippines. And the Philippines is one of the many developing nations that have turned to information and communication technology as a tool to improve teaching and learning, and whose educational system reveals many of the same problems and limitations of its fellow developing nations. Meaning, although the Philippines has um, implemented the ICT in integrating it to teaching and learning, there are also problems with it, just like in other countries. Since unfortunately, the implementation endures from several weaknesses: the absence of documentation and information on how ICT is used, and also there is a lack of coordination between public and private sector efforts, and not sufficient teacher preparation. Um, Specifically, there is uncertainty whether computers in school are fully utilized for educational computing, which is very important when implementing ICT, especially if there is an ICT subject. Also, there were also other concerns that computers meant for students were instead being used by teachers for lessons, were um, were used for playing games instead. So that is one of the many problems the Philippines is facing when implementing this ICT policy. Now, educational researchers stated that the lack of documentation regarding ICT use is one of the major problems when implementing ICT policy, especially in the Philippines, also exists in many countries. Now, in developing countries, data that could help determine how scarce educational resources should be distributed or how effectively they are being used are simply not available. Since teacher preparation is not sufficient, some training programs for teachers emphasize the use of specific software packages in the integration of ICT in the curriculum. That is why if teachers dare to use ICT without adequate training, they are likely to do it inaccurately, or the training that they have gone through will not be effective when applying ICT in the teaching and learning. That is why, therefore, the Philippines or the Philippine national policy has been formulated in the advanced use of ICT and education. The Senate Committee on Education, in cooperation with the DEX, launched Project CARES in March 2001. Project CARES was designed to upgrade the use and application of ICT in public elementary and secondary schools nationwide. The primary concern of the project is the school administration to respond to the need for accurate and timely data that administrators and teachers need to manage their classes. Since Philippines as a developing country are committed to instilling schools with ICT, is hopeful that these technologies will improve teaching and learning in today's knowledge of society.